Aloha and welcome to Invited Back. I'm Sabbath Kapahu. We're continuing in a deep dive mini-series based on the sessions at Stimulate Summit. Before I continue today's topic, I want to put a trigger warning and an audience suggestion. If you happen to be listening to this with littles in your presence, put on your earbuds or come back to it when you have a space to engage in a more adult conversation. And in a similar vein, if you're scrolling through this on Facebook, hi family, then you can keep scrolling and come back to it when you are in appropriate company. I am going to be talking about the session called Becoming Rule Breakers. I had the honor and joy of interviewing a friend and colleague, Shayna Weisgerber. What I loved about the way this conversation began and came about and really has continued on even since the summit was Shayna was born and raised in Texas. She's a Texas girl through and through. I was born in Hawaii, but raised in Washington State, and now I'm back in Hawaii. We couldn't really be more geographically separated as far as just where and how we were raised. But the more we started in conversation, the more we realized how similar some of our experiences, a lot of our experiences were in the fact that we grew up in the midst of purity culture in the church, in the golden era of youth group. And we found ourselves falling flat on our faces, for the lack of a better word, when we moved into marriage in our young adult lives as 20 somethings coming out of this absolute like shunning of any talk of desire or sexual intimacy. We just knew enough to stay away from it. It wasn't talked about in my household, surprise, surprise, and it wasn't a space to be explored. So when we started talking about it together, we found so much solidarity, and we found a freedom to really realize that we were not alone. And that is the heart behind all of these discussions at Stimulate Summit, where the goal is to be encouraged, to gain confidence, and to build stamina. And we're not going to survive in our relationships if we don't have spaces to talk about sex like our marriages depended on it. And so the conversation around becoming rule breakers was the reality that when we were newlyweds, and still to this day, there is a mental space that we have to continually break free from. Sorry, I have this hair on my nose. We have to continually break free and break through in order to engage in sexual intimacy with our spouse in the way that we were designed. And we talked about in the session how those first months, years, really were a lot of trial and error, and more error than success. And it was a continual return to a space that was completely unknown. Now, having called the session Rule Breakers, I feel like I have to say that I broke some rules. I broke rules that I had said I would keep in that season of the golden youth group era. I would, and even in that, as soon as I was able to have conversations about what was going on in those spaces that I knew were wrong, there was so much freedom from shame. So we talked about a lot of things in our session, and that's why I put this trigger warning at the beginning, and I'll say it again here. There is some real emotional heaviness to the area of sexual intimacy, even in the midst of the best marriages. When you are coming into a marriage relationship, it doesn't matter who you are. You're coming in with past experiences. You're coming in with expectations. You're coming in with a boatload of emotions, whether you know it or not. And those are the things that have to get worked out in the stillness or the chaos of whatever happens in the bedroom. And we talked about what it was like in those first years as we were like coming into our new identities as wives. How do you talk about these feelings that you're having with your spouse? How do you talk about desiring each other? How do you fulfill those desires? And this isn't a space where I'm going to get into all of that. We talked about it in the session, but the heart is to realize as wives, these are vital conversations to be having with each other, because we want to know that we're not the only ones. You're not crazy. You're not full of all these things that nobody else has experienced. In fact, you're quite normal. And I wanted to read a couple quotes from this book, God Loves Sex by Dan Allender and Tremper Longman. And this really goes in the next session too with resources. But in the introduction, this is what he says. I'm going to read from a couple different sections. But he says, sexual desire is meant to become more holy and whole the longer we live. Something Shane and I talked about in this session is that it gets better and better, but you have to get through the hurt, the heartache, the disappointment, the something's not working right, something doesn't feel right. I liked this yesterday, I don't like it today. You have to have those conversations in order to develop who you are and what your sexual desire means for yourself and for your husband and for your marriage and for your relationship, because we all know that what's happening or not happening in the realm of sex within your marriage is affecting everything else in your life. It really is. So again, he said, more holy and more whole the longer we live. It's important to consider what it means to be holy and how that relates to sexual desire. One thing that Shayna spent a lot of time talking about in our session was sex as worship. Now, she comes to that conversation having years, decades of service in the church staff positions as a worship pastor. And she talked a lot about how sometimes we show up to Sunday morning service and we can put on our best and we can sing all the songs, but if we haven't done the work in our hearts, if we haven't done the work in the quiet places where nobody is watching, then our experience of worship is going to be a lot different. And the same thing happens in the sexual relationship, in intimate spaces, in marriage with our spouses, except we have to show up every time, and we can't just put on a face, because our face has to be there and in it. And I will admit to the reality that sometimes my mind can be totally somewhere else and not in the physical space that my body is present in. If that is you, you are not alone. It takes work to center ourselves. It takes work to focus in. It takes work to be present. And there's some times that you do not feel like showing up, but you know what's going to happen when you get there. So you show up. And we talked about that reality. So it's so much more. It's a layered. It's never just about one thing. It's about all of the things that lead up to the intimate spaces in marriage. And really, again, going back to the idea of the title of the session being called Becoming Rule Breakers, for many of us, it is having to cut away a lot of layers of misconception, misunderstanding, maybe miscommunication about what we thought this was supposed to look like, about what we thought sexual desire was. and really becoming more holy and more whole as time goes on and you continue in that experience with your spouse. Now, as I've said in other sessions, and as I will continue to say, everybody's experience is different. And I can't sit here and say that it gets better with time for everybody. I can't sit here and say that it doesn't matter where you came from, because where you are in your marriage now is where you're supposed to show up every time. All of these things that all the spaces that you came from make a difference. And so there are often situations where a lot of work has to be done in our hearts and in our minds to have the freedom to walk into sexual intimacy with your spouse and grow in holiness and grow in wholeness. But it takes a lot of work. I wanted to read one other a quote from this book. He said, "Sex is not only sensual and physical, it is also profoundly personal and spiritual. To separate our sexuality from our spirituality is to rob both of meaning and passion. Holiness is not a flight from our body or an aversion to sensuality." Let me read that one more time. To separate our sexuality from our spirituality is to rob both of meaning and passion. Holiness is not a flight from our body or an aversion to sensuality. Now, I'm already 12 minutes in. This is over the time that I meant to be talking about this. As you can tell, this is just touching the surface of the conversation. And that is really what Shane and I only had time to do, is to touch the surface, because there is layers and a depth to these conversations that take time. And my heart here in this space is to give you permission, grace, safety, and solidarity to say, yes, we have been there. We have experienced the hard and the heartache and the holy and the really good. And you are not alone on this journey. If you want to continue this conversation, shoot me a DM wherever you spend time on social media. And you can find me at Sabbath Kapahu or Invited Back, pretty much anywhere. And we can continue this conversation together. If you would like to have access to the full session that Shayna and I did for Stimulate Summit, DM me and we can talk about how to get access for you. This is just the beginning of the conversation, or just a continuation of the things that you have felt in your heart and your mind. This is a space to be encouraged, to truly gain confidence, and to build stamina, because we're in this for the long haul. Until next time.